Once upon a time, in the warm and pleasant land of Valnapopia, there lived a princess named Maria. This young lady of noble birth lived a privileged life under the protection of her dear parents, the king and queen. Maria was a spoiled girl who saw those around her as tools to be used in her service. And why not? For her father was lord and master of the land. He was a man who had risen to greatness through hard work and good fortune. He had made his fortune by trading in potent and exotic substances. In times gone by, there were many such traders throughout the land, but the king had eliminated his competition. How had he done this? One could only assume that great magic was at work. The monarch did indeed have several wizards and witches in his keep. He also, of course, kept a court of enforcers and retainers, as well as ladies of the night. This did not sit well with the queen. The royals were feared by all. By some they were respected. Others of a more thoughtful and philosophical nature despised the first couple and their children. Princess Maria would spend her days in the company of her sycophantic followers, all the daughters of lords and ladies. She had no real friends. She had not the first idea what real friendship was. She would amuse herself with vainglorious pursuits and cruel games, as one might expect of a spoiled brat. Of course no one criticised her behaviour. To do such would be tantamount to suicide. The king and queen had one other child, Prince Reginald. The prince enjoyed two things more than anything else. He loved to ride about the kingdom in his horseless carriage with great speed, and would make merry by running over vagabonds and peasants. Some would be killed, others merely maimed. Oh, how the prince would laugh at their screams! When he wasn't slaying bumpkins and nomads, he could be found forcing himself on pretty young things. Any girl foolish enough to resist his passions would be lucky to escape with a beating. Others would simply disappear. The queen had loved her king once, before he had become powerful. He had been a different man. He had been capable of compassion and loyalty in his younger days. Now he had been consumed by the burden of his crown. He was beset with fear. His enemies were growing in number and strength, which is why he had to remain on the offensive. Those who would do him harm had to see and feel his strength. The king knew he could rely on the giant. Here was a creature 6 times bigger than the average man. He could crush a skull as you or I could crush an egg. His brutality was matched only by his faithfulness to the crown. He carried no weapons, for he needed none. His mere presence was enough to make almost all men tremble. Although the royals were rich beyond the comprehension of most, the common people of Valnapopia suffered in poverty, their hardship made all the worse by the tyrant's cruel hand. They hoped that someone from among them would rise as champion and smash the chains which held this land in bondage. But the candle of hope flickered dimly. The kingdom was full of indulgences, and a dark magic held the people in check. One day, a wanderer from another land happened upon Valnapopia. He had wandered far and wide. If you were to ask this man why he had done this, or inquired as to what he was searching for, he would not have been able to give you a clear answer. The man went by the name of Thaddeus. Thaddeus was tired and thirsty, and so stopped to rest and refresh in a tavern called the Bull's Scrotum. He approached the bar and asked for an ale. For a lingering moment the barmaid stood and stared at the stranger, as if in a trance. Thaddeus produced a silver coin which seemed to break the spell. He sat in the corner and supped on his beverage, taking the place in. Two bearded men sat at the far end of the pub, glaring at this new face in town. Thaddeus noticed these unkempt fellows and allowed himself a little smile. After settling himself somewhat, he resolved to speak. "Pardon me, good gentlemen, might I inquire as to where I am?" The two bearded goons looked sideways at each other, irritation and confusion plastered on their ugly faces. Thaddeus continued, "What realm is this, men?" The older of the two men stood and swayed a little, clearly inebriated. He spoke. "I don't know who you are, stranger, nor where you came from, but heed these words. Go back from whence ye came. Consider this a friendly warning rather than a threat." The barmaid started up. "This is the one and only Valnapopia, my man, land of woe, realm of dark magic, home and playground of Oswald the Wicked King. Best be going back the way you came, like Fred said, my lover." Thaddeus finished his drink and thanked the locals for their advice. Before he could reach the door, the second man, who had remained silent until now, almost shouted, "Beware the prince, my lord. Many of my friends never saw him coming." Thaddeus left with these words ringing in his ears. But as he looked around at the stone cobble roads and the quaint little cottages, he found it difficult to believe that this place was half as bad as the tavern dwellers had made it out to be. Even so, the thought crept into his mind that perhaps it would be better to turn back, or just pass on through without stopping anywhere else or talking to anyone. This thought was soon cast aside, though. Our man was hungry, and it was getting late. He needed a place to sleep for the night. He had only to walk another half-mile before he came upon an inn. The innkeeper greeted him in much the same way the barmaid had earlier. Thaddeus could safely assume that visiting outsiders were few and far between in these parts. Nevertheless, a room was available as luck would have it. The stranger presented 2 silver coins and was shown to his quarters. The room was sort of cramped and dingy, but our man cared not. He threw his bag on the floor and lay down on the straw bedding. He thought he might drift off into the land of Nod, but then his stomach began to growl at him. With some trouble, he managed to haul himself up and out the door. He inquired with the innkeeper where he might get some food this evening. The innkeeper kindly offered to make Thaddeus some peacock and mushroom stew, which he assured him was a local delicacy. Our man gladly accepted and was told it would be ready in 1 hour. "I'll bring it to your room, sir," said the kind host, and promptly made his way to the kitchen. The wanderer returned to his room to have a lie down. He must have fallen asleep, because he had been unceremoniously woken by a loud crash outside in the street. He simply had to investigate. The scene was a gruesome one, and shocking to say the least. One of the men who had warned him about this place not but an hour ago now lay dead in the street, blood still gushing from a hole in his head. What a vile horror! A comely wench stood shocked by the roadside, her eyes fixed on the victim. From within the carriage, in front of the outsider, now came thunderous laughter, which slowly gave way to a mocking cackle. Out stepped a well-dressed young fellow, glowing with self-satisfaction. He briefly surveyed the scene, taking it all in. He turned and looked at the stranger. Instead of the fearful bowed head he had become accustomed to seeing, he was met with a stern look of disgust. The smug grin was wiped from the prince's face. The stare-off didn't last long. As Reginald lost his nerve, he jumped back into his fancy carriage and sped away. Later at supper, the innkeeper would tell the outsider all about the kingdom and what he might expect should he choose to stay. Our man listened intently. With a belly full of stew and a mind filled with righteous rage, the outsider returned to his room and rested his weary bones. Princess Maria lay on a bed of silk sheets in her stately apartment, talking to the fairies, which now danced excitedly about her head. The fairies would often put in an appearance when the spoiled girl imbibed her favourite potion, a mixture of exotic and not so exotic plants and herbs. The small winged creatures would tell the princess how beautiful she was, and they would assure her that she was highly regarded by all men of the kingdom. Of course, Maria knew that many plebeians were jealous of her looks and her standing, but what could a girl do? She could and did spend much time in front of the mirror admiring herself. A circle of flatterers were almost always on hand to lay it on thick with high-flown praises. A little part of the princess died whenever she wasn't the centre of attention. When in the company of her dear parents, she would have to take a back seat much of the time, but in her apartment she was the sun, all else merely orbited and admired. But today she was in for an unpleasant surprise. The intoxicated royal rose from behind her bed and moved towards the window to where her followers beckoned. Some gnomes were at work in the royal gardens, as they often were at this time of day, and the ladies had a mind to throw stones at them and shout curses. What an affront! The gnomes hurriedly went back beneath the surface where it was warm and relatively safe. The ladies continued to giggle. What fun it was to see little creatures in a state of panic and distress. How gay! As the girls were about to move away from the window, Reginald came screaming up at breakneck speed in his familiar carriage, and began to call to his sister. "Let me come up, Maria, and speak with thee," said the prince, his voice uneasy. It was unusual for her brother to come here unannounced like this. What could have happened? Maria dismissed her followers and had the guards at the gate stand aside for Reginald. The prince told of his meeting or stare down with a stranger in town, an outsider. He had been deeply troubled by this, and so had gone into the southern forest to meet with the Purple Witch. This she was called on account of her hideous skin conditions. The Purple Witch was well known for being able to predict possible futures with striking accuracy. Naturally, Reginald wanted to know the significance of this meeting and this strange man. The horrid woman broke several bird eggs into a grubby-looking pan before adding a few herbs and spices. She poked around this mixture with a dirty stick for a moment before recoiling in shock and horror. "Beware Thaddeus the noble, my lord," said the witch. The prince demanded to know more, and the purple one continued. This stranger could be the champion around which people and creatures of the land unite against thy father. But despair not, my lord, nothing here is written in stone. You can confront and kill this outsider. With your sword he might find his end. With this the prince took his leave and did not turn back to look at the witch. If he had done so, he would have seen a smile, almost a mile wide, on the old hag's repulsive face. The prince and the princess took little time to decide on their next course of action. They would go running to Mummy and Daddy. Word was sent ahead that the children were coming to Oswald's palace, the largest and most extravagant building in all the kingdom, as one might expect. When Maria and Reginald arrived, their father was there to meet them in the main hall. The monarch stood, stone-faced, and greeted his children coldly. Reginald told the king everything he had said to his sister. The king was visibly shaken by the news, and had to sit down on his throne. Oswald respected the powers of the Purple Witch. This was a situation that had to be dealt with swiftly, and with ruthless brutality. This was the only way Oswald knew. The prince awaited his father's words, expecting that he should be called upon to lead a search and destroy party, but the king called for his giant. The beast came forth from the shadows, and knelt at his master's side. King whispered something into the monster's ear, before sitting back and reclining somewhat in the supreme chair of state. The giant wasted no time. He bounded towards the drawbridge, which was lowered by some of the king's men, as fast as they could. As his massive frame disappeared out of view, the queen emerged, and embraced her children